Well, hello. This is Bob Odell from Root Source, and today we are interviewing. Dr. Young, I can hardly find the words to say how much I've been looking forward to interview you, Dr. Brad Young, the translator of the Newer Testament. Welcome to Root Source.
Well, it's such an honor to be here with you, Bob, and just thank you for coming. I've been looking forward to this time of talking with you. We've developed such a close friendship over
a couple of years. And early on in those 2 years, I made a promise to you that I wanted to interview you about this work you were doing on the translation of the New Testament. And lo and behold, it's out. It's available right now. And so this interview, I think maybe the delay was a good thing.
Maybe it was.
Well, the book is the Newer Testament, an English translation which affirms the New Testament's authentic Hebrew heritage. Well, that's an interesting subtitle for a translation to the New Testament. What's this about? Why did you do a book like this?
Well, our goal was to hear as they heard. And when we look at the Hebrew heritage, you're going to find the actual context, reconstruct the context for Jesus' life and ministry. I think how many times as believers, when we're reading the Bible, we're praying, you think, what would it have been like to be one of the original disciples?
Yes.
To sit at Jesus' feet.
Yes.
Maybe to have that cultural orientation.
Yes.
To really understand Jesus in the language that he was speaking in. So this translation begins with the Hebrew scriptures, the Older Testament, if you will, or the Tanakh. And we are using that as the platform. You have to start with the prayers of the Torah to understand the prayers of the Gospels. And so we are learning the faith of Jesus, which will strengthen our faith in Jesus so that we can hear as they heard.
So I think I heard someone say once that there's over 100 translations of the New Testament, the Greek New Testament. And this is not a translation from Hebrew directly. I mean, you start with the Greek manuscripts, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. So why one more translation? What is unique here versus the 100 or so that have come before?
Yeah, there are many good translations, and every translation should be evaluated based on the goals. And so here we've set some goals that are different. Most translations have 2 steps. They start with the Greek, and then they translate it from that first step to the second step into easy to understand English, or maybe for a particular denomination or public reading or private devotions. We have 3 steps. We start with the Greek canonical text, but then we go to this intermediate step before we go to English, thinking, well, how would this have been understood by a Jewish audience? We know that Jesus probably didn't teach in Greek. He probably taught in Hebrew, maybe sometimes in Aramaic, and he was speaking to a Jewish audience. So today we read it as a Christian audience. And so our goal is to do a Hebrew reconstruction. And we have a Hebrew literal translation, but what we call functional equivalency. Take, for instance, the word Pharisee. Today, if you look up the word Pharisee in an English dictionary, it'll say hypocrite. That's one of the meanings.
Yes.
Well, in the first century, the Pharisee had a different meaning. Many times people thought of the Pharisees as spiritual leaders. Maybe just like today where we have spiritual leaders, they may not always live up to the teaching. They may be pretenders sometimes. But you didn't think of hypocrites. So when we say, take a saying of Jesus where he says, unless your righteousness exceeds the righteousness of the Pharisees, well, people think, oh, those hypocrites, we can do better than that. But we translated the word Pharisee as spiritual leader. So unless your righteousness exceeds the righteousness of the spiritual leaders, well, that helps you hear as a first century audience heard.
As they would have heard it. Okay. Affirms the New Testament's authentic Hebrew heritage. So when you say hear it as they heard it, we're really going back to how they heard it, because they heard it in Hebrew, in a Hebrew environment and a Hebrew culture.
Yeah, so it's Pharisaioi, you say spiritual leaders. That's a good translation. Okay. And we explain in the notes sometimes where we change this. Another example might even be like good eye. If your eye is good, your body is filled with light. Well,
right.
The word hoplos there is not exact. It's like good, but good eye was a very good Hebrew idiom, which means generosity. So we actually translate it, if your eye is good, showing generosity, or if your eye is bad, uncovering a stingy temperament. So you actually get the meaning.
Okay.
I noticed in the ESV, English Standard Version, which is a good translation, they translated, if your eye is healthy. Well, they're trying to get that Greek word hoplos, which is like agathos, good, healthy, but you totally misunderstand it because it has nothing to do with the health of your eye. It has to do with a generous spirit. And we can see this in many Hebrew idioms. We can go back to Deuteronomy 15. We can look at Proverbs, where it says a good eye is someone that's very generous.
So we're going to, in this interview, we're going to get into maybe some of the interesting cases that you've talked about. But first, let's just run just a couple of facts about you. First of all, the translation has your name on it. Do I understand then you were the primary translator of the entire, of every book of the New Testament in this?
Yes,
is correct?
When we were looking at this project, I'd actually hoped that it would have other people that would help in the translation. We felt like sometimes Christians misunderstand the Jewish context. Sometimes there's even anti-Jewish sentiments that guide translations and misunderstandings about the Jewish people in the first century. So we felt there's an urgent need to do this. But as it turned out, I was the one that was translating. I had people I could consult with, and we had a group of people that would interact with us. And I translated it over a 25-year period.
25 years.
And
okay.
But if it's good, you can. I'll say some of these consultants help me. If it's bad, you can look at me. It's a humbling experience to translate.
You're trying to walk that fine line between. You did most of the primary work yourself with consultants, of which I've heard you talk about. You had over a dozen people that were sort of close to the project,
yes.
And consulting and looking at it. And I've heard you talk about you've had over 100 reviewers that were really going through it in a very detailed way. So you're not just alone. But on the other hand, you were you were making the primary decision according with review, but you were just the way it happened.
Yeah, I had some excellent scholarly help in the consultation, proofreading, some of the proofreaders and others. And I talk about a lot of these key people, some of them in the acknowledgments, but I made the decisions. And it's really a one-person translation in some way. So there's strengths and weaknesses in that.
There always
I've worked with Bible Society committees, and there's some great things that happen. And I think when you work with a committee, you also realize, sometimes you don't feel like the committee always goes in the right direction. But this is a companion. You can use this as a translation to compare with your favorite translation and judge it, evaluate it for these goals that we had. How does it help you reconstruct this historical situation in the first century? And I think it'll make your favorite translation more understandable, and you'll enjoy it more. And I think many people are saying this is their primary translation now, and they're really using it in Bible study.
And as I've read this, it certainly breaks you out of the mold of that. There's a certain pattern of the words but this takes you out of that mold, and you have to really hear it. Exactly what you're trying. You have to hear it because it's not using the exact same words, but it doesn't stray. I mean, I catch, I love this because it doesn't take me into a different field. It's just a slight different look. Let me ask you, you obviously know Greek and Hebrew. How many languages do you know? I really don't know the answer.
Well, in my doctoral work, I had to do readings in German, so and I used to speak German. I haven't used it very much, but I do use it in reading and research. And of course, we studied a lot of Aramaic and we studied Greek. And but my main language in working in this was Hebrew. But I studied in modern Hebrew at the Hebrew University when I did my doctorate. I actually taught as a lecturer at Hebrew University for a couple of years, so I had to teach in modern Hebrew. And so you have the Mishnaic Hebrew of the Mishnah, you have the Hebrew of the Dead Sea Scrolls, and then you have the later biblical Hebrew. And a lot of times that's kind of our issue when we're translating or reconstructing certain sayings, is it's not just to understand the Hebrew, but which Hebrew, what type, what's the language. And the Apostle Paul, he called himself a Hebrew of the Hebrews, but he wrote his letters in Greek, but his thinking, his theology is very Hebraic.
Makes
and
sense.
It's very, Paul is riveted to the Torah. I believe he really loved the Torah, and sadly, many Christians have misunderstood some of the statements that Paul has made about the Torah, taking them out of the total context of his message.
I cannot do an interview without finding out about somebody's origins. You mentioned you taught at Hebrew University. You've obviously, which is in Jerusalem, so you've obviously spent some time in Israel. But I want to go back to the beginning. When you were a kid, did you dream of translating the Bible?
No, I love the Bible. I grew up in Oklahoma. My parents were very active in the Baptist church, and I had a deep faith experience at 12 years old, and I just loved to study the Bible. At 14, actually, I even had a desire to learn Greek, and I had a youth director friend that was taking a Greek course, and so I got the grammar by Machen, and I would study it 30 minutes a day. And then on the weekends, when he came in at Saturday, I would take the test he had taken that week, and we would talk about Greek. And so, I was, learning about the Bible at that time.
Wait. How did you have a youth director who wanted to talk about Greek? Where did you meet this guy?
Well, he was at the church, and the church, wanted,
Your church?
biblical foundation. My mother, I've got to thank her as well. She read, I have two brothers, and she read us Bible stories every night. Especially my older brother and I, my oldest brother, we've talked together. And also my middle brother, but my oldest brother, he has 7 kids, and he's talked about how reading the Bible to his children, like my mother read to us, I will say that with my family, but it just has changed our lives. And, that really helped me to start it. Yes.
Your mother reads the Bible to you daily?
Daily.
And from a young age, at age 12, you have an experience with God, a profound experience, and by 14, you want to learn Greek, or you want to...
I wanted to, because there were Bible passages that I didn't understand. I didn't like the explanations. One in particular, which I think is related to this translation project, is how Jesus said, do not think that I've come to destroy the law. And then, it seemed like in the teachings of our church, we were saying, well, the law isn't so important. You're not under law, you're under grace. Mm-hmm. And so it seemed a little contradictory. And it really started coming clear to me when I went to Israel for the first time in 1972. And I began to see this connection between living a life with grace, as many Jewish people do, but also following ethical principles. And
Well, I want to ask about that next. So let's take a break. And when we come back, I want to hear how you got to Israel and what happened when you got there. So until next time, until we continue, this is Bob Odell from Root Source saying shalom. Welcome back to Root Source. This is Bob Odell, and we're with Dr. Brad Young, the translator of the Newer Testament, an English translation which affirms the New Testament's authentic Hebrew heritage, or as you like to say, hear it as they heard it, right?
That's right.
Okay. So we talked about the basic ideas of the translation and a little bit of your early life. How did you get to Israel, and when did you get to Israel?
Well, Bob, I was very fortunate because my grandfather, who was a pharmacist, he was a Baptist deacon, and in some ways he was thought to be a little radical in the church, to be honest. But he had traveled to Israel in 1936 and 1956. He actually traveled from Cairo to Damascus on the trains, and he had a rabbi that was his traveling companion. They became fast friends. And he would tell me all these stories. And in 1972, he paid my way to go to Israel.
1972.
At
Paid
that
your
time,
way.
I
Wow.
was involved in a coffee house ministry that I'd started in our little community in Oklahoma. And we had 3 churches that were involved in their youth groups. But when I went to Israel, it seemed like this is where I would really understand the Bible and begin to see Jesus as a Jewish individual, a Jewish leader, a Jewish teacher, and here he's interacting with his own people. And I think most people that read the New Testament, they see Jesus as the Christian kind of having a fight with these Jews. And so instead of seeing this family discussion, we don't see that right interaction. It's very interesting, famous biblical scholar in Israel, Micha Gutman. I remember one time he was talking, he said, what's the essence of Jewish faith? It's the machloket. That is a sharp debate. You're learning by interacting with one another. And that's what we see in the New Testament. It's so much of a Jewish expression of faith. You discover the truth through discussion and interaction. And of course, Jesus is proclaiming the kingdom. And we see these beautiful stories of a miracle where there's a teaching involved. And so we have to see that context in Israel. So, when I went to Israel, I had to study in Hebrew at the Hebrew University. I remember with the class's wonderful scholar who had such an impact on me, David Flusser.
The David Flusser.
The David Flusser.
He's impacted so many people, has touched so many lives.
I was so fortunate to be able to write my doctoral dissertation under his direction, also with Shmuel Safrai, and then I worked as his research assistant for 8 years away. I edited one of his books, but we became very close.
Obviously, he's a professor at Hebrew University, but what is he known for? What was
he became very famous for the study of the Dead Sea Scrolls. And he edited a critical edition of Yosipon. This was a text that dealt with the history of the Second Temple period, written, not Josephus, but written much later. But he received the Israel Prize for that very, very great honor. Wow. And he published on the New Testament. He really became a leading scholar in New Testament studies and the Dead Sea Scrolls, a linguist. He had a classical background. He began with classical Greek. Okay. He was born in Czechoslovakia.
And he's passed away now.
He's passed away
since
now.
2015, I believe, right?
Right.
Okay.
But he has such a contribution.
And he had such a relationship with his students, too. And that's when I said the David Flusser. I'm actually thinking about how his, the professor-to-student relationship was very special. Many people claim him as a special, their most favorite professor or whatever. So what was it like interacting with him? I think I interrupted you when you were about to talk about that.
Well, I think that really helped me see the importance of this translation. I'll say, a translation is such a big project. It wasn't something I thought I should do or I necessarily wanted to do, but I did see the need. But, he would read the Greek text. You'd think in modern Israel, students would come in with a modern translation of the New Testament in Hebrew and you discuss it. No. Flusser, you had this little finger. He's reading the Greek text we're talking about. We had to translate from Greek into Hebrew, so we were using modern Hebrew. But you think, well, how was that in Mishnaic Hebrew? How was that in Biblical Hebrew? What did that mean in the Talmud? What would that mean in the Midrash? What would that mean in the Dead Sea Scrolls? What is the original Jewish context? And I begin to see just in these classes. We also read the Apostolic Fathers in Greek and studied them in Hebrew with David Flusser. And we read, other books. Much of the focus, I was working on the parables of Jesus. I've written a couple of books on the parables of Jesus, but David Flusser really helped me in seeing the parables and the connection to rabbinic parables from maybe a little later period, some at the same time. But that really taught me how to translate to understand the culture, the context, going from Greek. Look at the context, then try to understand it in English, then try to put it in a functional equivalency. It needs to be a literal translation. You don't make up the translation. It has to be based on that Greek text, but it needs to communicate what it did in the first century. So sometimes we're so focused on getting a modern English translation that we forget what was the context. What were, the books of the New Testament were written by Jewish people for Jewish people, or Luke, who may not have been Jewish, was using Jewish sources. They were written sources and eyewitnesses that were Jewish that he was communicating.
So it's not like David Flusser was a Messianic Jew or anything, but he was interested in early writings that might give insight into the Jewishness of the period, right? The Jewishness of the first century, and what better place to get to go look than the New Testament, right?
Yes, he was orthodox in his faith. He was devout. I had the privilege of sharing Passovers with him or Shabbats. I used to sometimes give him a ride to the university. I remember one time coming, maybe a little early, but he was, wrapped in his talit, his prayer shawl, praying, and we talked a lot about the spiritual issues. And I think that was something that David Flusser had. He had kind of an insight into the spirituality of the Jewish people in the first century, and he could see this emerging in the text. So you see a better relationship between Jesus and his contemporaries, and also understand the issues to sharpen them better. Flusser had a great acumen that he could go to the Dead Sea Scrolls, or I remember one time giving him a text from the Middle Ages, and he started translating it into Greek. He said, sometimes if we translate the Dead Sea Scrolls from Hebrew into Greek, then we would understand the connection to the New Testament. Isn't it not a bad idea? So, but he would go, this is what it would be in classical Greek. This is what it is in Koine. This is what it would be in the Church Fathers. But, you had to kind of have that linguistic depth. I would say in America, many times we teach people how to translate using a dictionary, lexicon. And I would say Flusser he would plunge you into the language. You would read these texts till they really become a part of you, and then you have a connection with that text that helps you. Now, you have to be objective. You have to do the linguistic the research. You have to be accurate in grammar. Grammar is very important in your translation work. But there's a level there that you're getting a part of that culture. You join the conversation.
Isn't that interesting? That this approach of plunging yourself into the text, into the culture, and yet that's exactly what you did. You went to Israel and plunged yourself into the culture there, and now you're offering a translation that tries to do this very same thing for the reader. I think this is fascinating. How key was it for you to go and have personal relationship with Orthodox Jews in Israel for this process?
It was foundational. I think living in Israel and I lived in a religious neighborhood for time, and of course I'm in Jerusalem, which is a city where you feel the holidays. I mean, on Yom Kippur, no traffic moves, and you have this sense of prayer and fasting. Or whether it's the Jewish New Year, Rosh Hashanah, or whether it's the time of Passover, you're kind of living this with the community, and you're getting some insights. And Orthodox Jewish people are living that faith as Jesus was more Orthodox. I mean, certainly Christianity and Judaism are different today than they were in those days, but it helps you understand that context and live the holidays, live the calendar, know the prayers, many of which were prayed in the temple.
I find it fascinating that your first, and you say there was many people that were close to you that had contributed this project, but the first name you mentioned is the name of an Orthodox Jew, professor at Hebrew University. Would you, David Flusser, would you claim him as your deepest relationship in the same way that I might claim Gadon Ariel as my deepest friendship?
Yes,
from Israel?
yes, he would be probably very much my deepest relationship. And I think one aspect of this translation is that I sometimes ask Jewish readers, David Flusser, others even, Holocaust survivors,
You've asked Holocaust survivors to read this? Wow.
They were friends, and they were concerned about improving understanding between the Jewish and Christian communities. And here's a sacred text. How do you read it? How do you understand it? Maybe there's a way we could translate accurately that would show some sensitivity to some of these issues where, I see Christian anti-Semitism as a Christian problem. That is, it might cause injury or hurt to Jewish people, but it's really our problem, Bob.
Yes.
Because it's in our family, our friends,
yes,
and reading our sacred text in a way that understands and embraces, as it did in the first century, seeing it as a conversation and the way that they're learning, it makes a big difference instead of this antagonism. I mean, there is Jewish blood on Christian streets because of misreadings of the New Testament and sometimes the spin we see from translation. So there's anyway, I think that has enriched my understanding of the New Testament. And I think it helps all Christians because they appreciate the faith of Jesus, and that strengthens their faith in Jesus because they can see the way he's living and interacting with others.
Wow. Well, I think it's time to not just talk about the outside of the book, but to open the book. Let's do that in our next segment. So until we come back, for Brad Young, this is Bob Odell from Root Source saying shalom. Well, thanks for joining us. We are back with Dr. Brad Young, the translator of the Newer Testament, an English translation which affirms the New Testament's authentic Hebrew heritage. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
And
so good to be with you, Bob.
We've had a segment on the basics in your early life. We've had a segment about the time that you spent in Israel. I'd like to move into the book now. There are three concepts I've heard you talk about. Explain what you mean when you talk about the importance of the audience, the language, and the family.
Well, I think what we see in the study of the Newer Testament is that there is a change of audience. Instead of a Christian audience, we are seeing Jewish people interact with one another, and so that has a big difference. Or when we talk about the language, if we only study Greek, if it's a translation of Hebrew, or if some of these conversations reflect understanding of the Torah, understanding of the Hebrew text, the Hebrew prayers of the people, the Hebrew teachings, that change of language can cause us to misunderstand the culture. There's also, I think, really, if you come down to it, it's a change of family. You think that the very first verse of the first book of the New Testament starts with the scroll recording the family ancestry of Yeshua, the Anointed One, the son of David, the son of Abraham, the father of Yaakov, Yitzchak, and Yaakov's the father of Judah and his brothers. This is the 12 tribes of Israel. And it's connecting Yeshua, Jesus, with the 12 tribes of Israel. And then you go, let's just think also, if you go to the Apostle Paul in Romans chapter 9, he talks about 7 special privileges. He says, they are the true Israelites. Now, I translated it true in square brackets because it seems like replacement theology was already starting in Rome. And he was saying, here are the true Israelites. That's the present tense. And he says, here are their blessings. First, they're adopted as children. Then he speaks of the Shekhinah, the glory in the wilderness. Then he talks about the covenants, the Britot. These next two are so interesting to me because he says, Matan Torah, the giving of the Torah, and the Avodah, the worship. Well, you know, even Shimon HaTzadik in the Pirkei Avot, he talks about what are the great 3 things. First, it's...
The Pirkei Avot being that sayings of the fathers.
Sayings of the fathers.
Of the rabbinical fathers. Go ahead. Yes.
And
he says...
Shimon HaTzadik says, it's the giving of the Torah, it's the divine worship, and it's acts of mercy, gamliut chasadim. And so 2 of these, Paul outlines giving of the Torah. Here we've got all of the worship, prayers, and then he talks about the promises, and then he says, according to the family ancestry, the patriarchs, Jesus comes. And you know, we go to the book of Revelation, you have the 12 tribes of Israel mentioned.
Yes.
You have the mother in chapter 12. I mean, most scholars would say that's Israel. I mean, some might say Mary, or, you know, there's different interpretations, but I think the best would say Israel gives birth to Yeshua. And how does Jesus appear in chapter 5? He is the Lamb, from the tribe of Judah. He is, you know, he doesn't appear as a Presbyterian. He doesn't appear as a Baptist. He appears in this fully Jewish form. So I think we see the family history from beginning to end.
Okay, so I have a question about this. So we talked about the 3 things: audience, language, and family.
Yes.
And we've been you've been giving some examples about how the Newer Testament centers some of its dialogue around family. But are you saying that, you know, we need to understand that the Newer Testament has family concepts in it? Or are you saying something deeper? Are you saying that we have to understand the family context to understand what's being written?
I think we need the family context. We need to have an understanding of Israel. Recently I had a conversation with a really great theologian who's a friend of mine in Sweden, has taught many years, just as I taught for 31 years at Oral Roberts University. It was wonderful to teach Bible translation and the Jewish roots of Christianity. But he was commenting, he was looking at systematic theology books. He's going to, not a single one that he found talked about Israel. You know, Israel is very important in the New Testament. Starts in Genesis 12, goes through Revelation. And so I'm saying that we need to have an understanding of Israel. There are also God-fearers in the New Testament that are believing in the God of Israel, coming to faith, and we have non-Jews coming to faith. We have non-Jews appear in the Gospel of Luke. We have Samaritans. We have, you know, all kinds of people that are very, because it's people. In fact, one translation that I think is very important that I made is of John 3:16. We usually say, "For God so loved the world." You know, some scholars say this is the cosmos. Recently, a translation came out talking about this, but really in Hebrew, how did they hear it? We translated it, "For God so loved the people of the world." And of course, Jesus came for all the people of the world. He came for his creation. But there's an emphasis here on Israel that we have to understand, a continuity from Genesis 12 to the book of Revelation. And I think understanding this change of family can help us understand it better, because we do not see Jesus as a part of the family of Israel.
So in that same vein of family, do you affirm in your translation what Paul's talked about in terms of the Gentiles being grafted in to the Jewish root? Is that grafting? You haven't come up with a different word for that, have you?
Well, this tree, you're grafted in. You have the wild olive branch. I think sometimes we cut off the tree we're sitting on. I mean, some people say the tree is, the patriarchs or Jesus or, whatever it is, it's Jewish. It has a connection to Jewish history. And we should nurture ourselves from the root. That's what the Apostle Paul's saying. You should have respect. And that's why he lists these prerogatives. These are the true Israelites, so that we would learn from the prayers. We would learn from the Torah. And he doesn't want us to change our identity as non-Jews, but he is wanting us to affirm and appreciate, value the faith of Jesus. And I think historically we've seen many times that Christianity has had an attitude of antagonism or hostility towards the Jewish people, sometimes even with persecution. Somehow there's this faith, well, if you disprove Judaism, that proves Christianity. I mean, the opposite is the case. And if the Judaism of Jesus isn't true, well, the faith of Jesus can't be true. So we have to see that continuity to strengthen these facts and to understand our own faith.
Well, let's go back to that first term, audience. How does understanding the audience apply with respect to the understanding of the Newer Testament?
Well, if we see Jesus discussing an issue of the Sabbath, we think, well, here's a Christian canceling the Sabbath. Or in Mark 7, it's very interesting where Jesus is talking about a heart issue. What touches the heart? And there's actually translations that add, and this isn't an integrated text anywhere, thus he declared all foods clean.
What?
I mean, this is in Mark 7:19. Really, the translation as we did it, we translate because it does not go into the person's heart, but only into the individual's stomach and is eliminated in a natural process. That's the translation. The food is eliminated into the drain, into the sewer. Yeah. It's a natural process. So Jesus was saying, it's your heart that's important. It's not what you're eating. But editors, translators, finally, Jesus said, you can eat anything you want. But Jesus was talking to people who ate kosher, and Jesus ate kosher. It was about the heart. He wasn't trying to purify all foods. But the translations, the RSV says, thus he declared all foods clean. It had nothing to do with declaring all foods clean. It was that your heart would be pure to God. And, we see other parts of the New Testament dealing with some of these other issues. But it's interesting how the translators wanted to make it, I would say, almost an anti-Jewish statement. Instead of just translating the active participle there and how it would be understood in the Greek. And there's other translations that have brought this out as well as my translation.
So let me see if I'm understanding fully what you're saying about audience. What I'm hearing, what I'm hearing is you're saying it's not just that to understand the New Testament, we need to understand that he was speaking to Jews. It's that we need to understand that he was speaking to Jews and affirming their Jewishness. Is this?
Yes, we know the Christ of the church, but we don't know the historical Jesus of the Jewish people. So, we need to reconstruct that. So if he's talking about Shabbat, is this permitted on Shabbat? We think, this is terrible. He's debating Jesus. Well, the question, is this permissible on Shabbat, is asked in hundreds of Jewish texts over and over again. What is permitted, what is not permitted? And Jesus answers the question by going to the halakha, the Jewish law. Well, if your animal, ox, falls in a ditch, you take him out. The Talmud has the same statement. If your ox falls in a ditch, you can the Talmud says, bring pillows to make him comfortable. If he climbs out, he climbs out. In other words, you can do anything to alleviate the suffering of the animal and thus preserve the Sabbath. But it is a legitimate question. I would also say, I think this is interesting because if you look in the Dead Sea Scrolls, they were super strict on the Sabbath, and they said, if your ox falls in the ditch, you will by no means take him out. So they prohibited this, we see that the Pharisees and many other Jewish people at the time, and Jesus discusses in the audience. But we don't see Jesus talking with a Jewish audience. We see Jesus, the Christian, fighting the Jews who are questioning him. And we don't see that this is a question that Jewish people ask. This is a question that is a part of everything. Now, there are some questions, later in the final week where I would say, and we bring this out, this other group, the Sadducees in particular, are probably asking, more provocative questions like, should you pay taxes to Caesar? But there's other times where we see just questions about Jewish faith and practice, and Jesus is interacting with people. They're silent. Way to understand that is that they agreed with Jesus. If Jewish people are quiet, they say, okay, I think that's right. But if they're quiet, if they're asking more questions, they say, maybe you can clarify this a little bit more, please. Maybe we don't understand. But you ask questions to understand. You don't ask questions to arrest somebody. Now, there is that context later in the final week, and we see the political issues, really, that, when you talk about paying taxes, this was a part of the Zealot movement. So here we do see that element, but sometimes people take a later context, they project it back so that we never see this original audience, Jesus and Jewish people discussing each other. It's kind of like being in a Jewish chat room where you're discussing things in the first century, and we have to put it in a church setting. Okay. And so this change of audience makes a big difference. I think it impacts your parable reading, it impacts the Sermon on the Mount. It's amazing. Wow. Martin Luther said the Sermon on the Mount was to show you your need for God because you're a terrible sinner. Nobody can keep the Sermon on the Mount. And I would say that is so wrong because Jesus taught the Sermon on the Mount as a plan of action, a plan of redemption. Okay. That when you turn the other cheek, when you go the second mile, when you love your enemies, you're bringing the kingdom, the force of God's love in this world. It was a plan that his followers should try to implement. It wasn't something about, well, now you're a terrible sinner, but it was a plan of action. Okay. So, again, I think here we're taking it out. Luther, great leader, had so many great things. We don't agree with everything, of course, that he was teaching, but he was taking it in Christian theology in a different audience, whereas if we place it in the first century audience, the Hasidim, some of these early teachers, they wanted humility, faith, love, prayer. How do you walk humbly with your God? Okay. So here's the Sermon on the Mount. It brings it all together. Love your neighbor as yourself. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. This is the law and the prophets. So you hear that in the Jewish context. Well, here's how we fulfill all of the law and the prophets. I can't know all 613 commandments, but I can take this message of the Sermon on the Mount and put it into practice.
Sure. What about the language? You said that you have to understand the language. Well, obviously it's Greek translated to English. What else is there? I mean, come on.
Well, you think of something like the poor in spirit. It's very hard to understand what that would mean, if you just say it in a Greek context. We have it in the Dead Sea Scrolls, the exact phrase. And it seemed to be, these are the followers, those that are dedicated to the community. I like to say it's those that know their need for the Spirit that they're looking at. Or you think about his name shall be called Jesus, for he will save his people from their sins. Well, Jesus in Greek is just a name, and sozo is to save. But if you put that in Hebrew, his name is Yeshua, for he will, Yoshia. See, the root is Yeshua. Jesus' name means salvation. His name means salvation. Or think about Zacchaeus. He said, I'm coming to your house today. Salvation has come to your house. I had a Jewish friend talking about this recently, a Jewish scholar. I asked him, why is he? He goes, well, it's obvious. Jesus' name is salvation, and he came to his house. Well, you might not think about that if you didn't look at it in Hebrew. Of course, scholars might interact and debate, but there are many terms. I think of the word emunah, amanah, maybe in the Mishnah for faith, pistis. Faith is just belief. It's not mind over matter. When we look at emunah in Hebrew and the way that Jesus is talking about, it's unrelenting resolve. It's a strong determination. I think sometimes he even uses it in a term chutzpah or chatzifa or chatzuf panim, we might even say. But it's that persistence. In the parable, he talks about the man who has to be persistent at midnight asking for help, and he has anadeia, shamelessness. He is help. It's a way of expressing your faith. Well, the Hebraic context helps us understand the Greek text. The Greek text also helps us understand the Hebrew, but we have to see that change of language, how that can lead us to just see Greek and English. We need to have this intermediate stage that will connect the Greek with the culture, the language of the people of the time, and then we bring it into English.
Wait. You just said an intermediate stage. In other words, you don't go from Greek to English directly. You stop in the middle and go to...
You examine this Greek text for the linguistic connections to Hebrew, especially when you're doing with the Gospels. But even when you're... I write in the book, I believe the first 3 Gospels were written originally in Hebrew, the first 15 chapters of Acts, and the book of Revelation. Well, on those books, looking at Hebrew background is very good. Some people say it's Aramaic. Aramaic and Hebrew are similar. One reason why I believe it's Hebrew, Bob, is that when you're writing a holy text in this period, we see this in the Dead Sea Scrolls and other examples, you wrote it in the language of Torah. You wrote it in Hebrew. And the people prayed in Hebrew. We have parables in Hebrew.
Do you think there were some Hebrew manuscripts early on for some
Yes.
of these books?
We have multiple sources from the early church leaders like Papias, who said that Matthew wrote the gospel in Hebrew. He wrote the words of Jesus. I would even say teologia there, where it says, sometimes people say it's like the events, the story, the narrative unfolding of the life of Jesus in Hebrew dialect, and everyone would translate it as they were able. We have other sources. Irenaeus talks about this, that when Paul and Peter were establishing faith communities in Rome, Matthew was telling these stories in Hebrew, and we have this gospel. He may have been talking in some regard of the Papias tradition, but we have multiple church fathers. Jerome talks about this. Others, I believe, were written in Greek. It's interesting, for instance,
certainly.
James, for instance, is written in a very good Greek. But even so, the theology, the thinking has roots in Hebrew sources.
True.
So I would say even with James, or the book of Hebrews especially, which is also written in a very fine Hellenistic style, that it talks about the worship in the temple, the tabernacle. It's using Hebrew terms. And so you have to kind of look at these early sources and their connections to Hebrew, even when they're written in Greek. So I think the study of Hebrew is essential for New Testament. And today we kind of separate the Older and the Newer Testaments, and people just study New Testament. They generally are proficient in Greek, and maybe they know a little Hebrew. They may not use Hebrew, but you have to really know both of these languages, I think, and understand the Jewish culture. I think the sources like Josephus or the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Talmud, even some of the later sources, the Mishnah, the Tanaitic literature that we have in the rabbinic literature, essential for understanding and grasping that context.
So what is the website that you can purchase the book on?
HebrewHeritageBible.com
Okay,
is
Hebrew Heritage
where
Bible.
the
Okay.
New Testament is
Right.
Testament is available, and we do the fulfillment. Try to send it to you the day or the next day. So anytime that you order at HebrewHeritageBible.com, we'll try to rush it to you.
The translation has been available since when did it become available?
November
November of 2020.
2020.
This is a soft cover. You plan a hardcover in 2021?
Yes,
correct?
yes.
Okay. Well, it's been great having you, but I would like to ask if maybe you could hang around for, maybe we could do one more segment. I'd like to do a bonus segment. And I want to surprise Dr. Young with a couple passages that I want to ask him some things that I want to know. But I'd like to invite you to stay with me if you want. But if not, be sure and get a copy of the Newer Testament from the HebrewHeritageBible.com. Well, thank you so much for joining us, and we'll come back for a little bonus round. But
thank you, Bob. It's such an honor to be with you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So until next time, this is Bob Odell, Dr. Brad Young. So privileged to be with him, and may the Lord bless you and bless you. And if you get one of these, and I really hope you do, get one of these, enjoy the pleasure of reading in a different way and hearing as they heard it. So until next time, this is Bob Odell with Root Source saying Shalom. Well, hi, this is Bob Odell with Root Source, and we are in a bonus segment with Dr. Brad Young. Dr. Young, I told you to turn to page 317, but I haven't told you what I want to ask about.
Okay.
Please tell me what you think about Galatians chapter 6. Let's start in verse 15 there, which is just interesting to listen to the translation here. Galatians 6:15. Finally, neither circumcision nor uncircumcision is what really matters, but rather experiencing the new creation. Verse 16. In addition, for those who will walk by this guiding principle, let shalom rest upon them, and mercy also upon the Yisrael of God. Dr. Young, this term, the Israel of God, has been a term that I've been in seminars where they take one whole panel question and go right down the panel and say, what do you think the Israel of God really means? And now I want to ask you, what is this Yisrael of God?
Well, this is a very controversial and text that's debated and translated different ways. I mean, some translations have translated it as an apposition, that is, Israel of God is being described by what comes before everyone who's walking by this guiding principle. But as many are pointing out, in the Greek text, there's a conjunction there. And
yes.
So I think this translation is better. And, a lot of other translations bring out that conjunction so that you have a blessing on those who are walking by the guiding principle, which first we got to talk about that briefly.
Okay.
And then he says, let shalom rest upon them, those walking by that principle. And mercy also upon the Yisrael of God. I think one thing you would understand if you read a lot of Jewish texts in the background is that many times Jewish authors will give a blessing upon Israel at the end of writing something. Mercy, peace, shalom. And so in this note, that's what I'm trying to describe. Probably one of the problems people have in Galatians is they get the wrong context. They feel like Paul is arguing against the Torah, when really he's arguing against a segment within the Christian community mentioned in Acts 15:1. And I think I have a text that explains this, and it's the best way to understand it from the context. Use the Bible to understand the Bible, the New Testament
Right.
to understand the New Testament. What was this group teaching? They said the non-Jews, God-fearers, or people who are coming to faith in Christ, the non-Jews who are coming to faith, they cannot be saved unless they're circumcised and keep the whole law of Moses. And it is explained very clearly in Acts 15:1. Well, the Apostle Paul, I believe, was writing Galatians before they made a final decision in Acts 15, where they actually decided, the early church fathers and the leaders. James is the one who actually talks about the decision. Well, non-Jews who are coming to faith, they have to abandon idolatry. They have to, keep these, 4 principles in some texts. We have 3, mainly, abandoning all idolatry, believing in the one God of Israel, living a moral, ethical life. Well, there were others that were saying, no, that's not enough. You have to convert to Judaism by circumcision and then keep all of the law. Galatians, Paul says, don't you know that anyone that's circumcised has to keep the whole Torah? To me, that tells us something about the Apostle Paul. He kept the Torah. He never stopped observing Torah. But did he want non-Jews to keep the whole Torah like him? No, because then they would be pretenders. It would, I think, Bob, it would really take away from his own Jewish identity. But if they're following Christ, if they're following Messiah, they need to abandon idolatry. I mean, many people believed in other gods. They needed to live a moral, ethical life. That's what they decided in the letter, finally, in Acts 15.
Yes.
So he has very sharp words to say about people who are teaching this. You've got to be circumcised. I mean, it's kind of vulgar language. I mean, I'm not the only one who that says this, where Paul says, well, why don't they just cut themselves? This is a false teaching. It's not relying on grace. You're saved by grace. But he also says, how do we keep the whole law? Love your neighbor as yourself. So I think here what he is saying is, I'm giving this guiding principle. Jewish people, they're living this out. They're, like me, I'm living my faith. But non-Jews, they don't have to be circumcised. They don't have to convert to Jewish faith and practice to be an essential part of our community. They are saved by grace through faith. They live a moral life, and on them let the peace go. And then he's talking about the Israel of God, the larger Israel community. He says, mercy be upon them. Now, I think if you look at the word Israel, it's used nearly 80 times in the New Testament, 76, depending on how you count it. And every time it means the children of Israel, the physical children. In the Older Testament, Israel is over 2,400 times. So I think here he's bringing the two together, the believing community who believe in Messiah, they're following this principle, and then he's saying, here we've got the Israel of God, mercy be upon them.
Wow, so the Israel of God is that Israel that is walking by the guiding principles.
Yeah, I think if you read Romans 9, Paul defines the true Israelites. And why would he give a different meaning?
Right.
He uses Israel, and it would include probably, in my opinion, in this case, some would say this would only be Jewish people who believe in Jesus, but I think when we look at Romans 9, he's talking about both Jews who believe and some who don't believe. He's saying they have these blessings of God. But it's meaningful in this context, because are you saying that non-Jews have to be circumcised? I mean, that's a logical conclusion. And Peter seemed to go back and forth. I mean, he initially went to Cornelius. Here was a God-fearer, a Roman, and he wanted him to be accepted into the community. But when we look at in this story of Galatians, at first he eats with non-Jews. I would assume he would be eating vegetarian, as sometimes Orthodox Jewish people do. I don't think that means he's eating non-kosher food. He's, maybe eating a salad or fish or, whatever he felt like was acceptable to have table fellowship. But when certain ones came from Jerusalem, he withdrew fellowship. So Paul confronts him. Here you're not even living consistent with your faith and practice. So, Paul here is trying to say this is really important to Paul. And think about Paul. Here he is, a Pharisee of the Pharisee, and he is magnifying his call to bring non-Jewish believers in. They're going to live the life. They're going to live a more life. They're going to be filled with the Spirit. It's very important. I think there's a pneumatology here too, because the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace. They are going to be guided by the Spirit. I love the Greek text there. It's like what one's translation is keep in step. It's almost like they're being They're being put on this walking this out. Halakha.
Yes.
You're walking in the Spirit. You're not going to violate the law. Paul specifies certain things that are really terrible. These are works of the flesh. Here's the fruit of the Spirit. He's not antinomian, but he's saying you don't have to be circumcised. You don't have to convert to Judaism. You don't have to keep all of these ceremonial laws that are given primarily to Israel. But the moral, ethical teachings are there. But there's mercy. There's a desire here for mercy to come on the Israel of God, all of them that are living in the covenant, all that are living according to Torah.
So it may be that some Christians, in hearing what you said, would say, well, Dr. Young has spent a lot of time with Orthodox Jews, spent a lot of time in Israel. He's sort of gotten to know them. He's being pulled in this direction. He's pushing the text to get to a result that he wants to get to. But wait, are you claiming that the way you're translating this is completely consistent with how you look at every other problem spot, if you will, in the New Testament? Are you saying you're consistent here?
Well, I feel like I've translated the Greek text accurately. Let shalom rest upon them and mercy upon the Israel of God. In the note, I'm explaining how I understand
how you understand.
That text.
Okay.
Now, you can debate whether I understood the text correctly or not. You can ask, did I translate it correctly? I think it's a good translation. And I think when we go to some text that, let's say, talk about a problem text, his blood be upon us and our children, I would say that's a tough text. Some I can explain from the translation. Sometimes I have a note. In that case, I have a note that goes into a little more detail. But I am trying in this translation to deal with texts where sometimes Christians misunderstand, or maybe there's been those that have said the Jewish people are responsible collectively.
Pushed it in the other direction.
For the crucifixion of Jesus. Of course, I would say the best answer is I am. We all are, because in Christian theology, at least, this is outside of history, but in theology, it was human need and God's grace. But there's a historical question, and Jews have been killed because of the way they've interpreted it historically. And the New Testament, I think, really makes it clear that it was Pilate, the Roman governor. This is something I might say, because I know you're...
Just before you go on, I just want to say thank you for that clarification, because there's two issues here. I was asking you, and I realize I asked you this, what do you think this means? That this is not the same as how it's translated. So you're saying the translation is accurate. You have an understanding of what the meaning is, but you separated that out and you make some commentary in the footnotes. Doesn't force the reader to come to the same conclusion. Through translation. I think that's a really important distinction.
Yes,
so thank
that's
you for
right.
saying that.
And I just point out, one of the concluding word in the note is walking in the Holy Spirit fulfills ethical monotheism in practice and preserves the expression of individual culture for all peoples. So in other words, the non-Jew walking in the Holy Spirit is going to live this moral, ethical life. Ethical monotheism.
Okay.
Believe in God. Okay. Love God, love your neighbor. But, they may eat ham and eggs for breakfast, or maybe they drive on Saturday. But, in the book of Acts, they decided, well, the non-Jew has this thing, but they're going to learn more. Maybe they'll want to keep Sabbath. Maybe they'll say, well, there's some health issues here or other issues, or maybe I just want to identify with the Jewish people. But you don't want to be a pretender. It doesn't make Jewish people feel happy if you're trying to pretend to be something you're not. But if you live and you love that culture, you can be a part of it and show. But Paul talks about a real honor and respect. And so we've had an antagonism. We haven't had a love and respect. So Paul this is how he decided it. Now, other scholars may see it a little bit differently or interpret it.
Sure.
But I think the Israel of God, what does it mean in the whole Bible? What does it mean every time Paul is referred to it? Why would it mean something else here? But, many people say here it means the church, and every place else it means Israel. Or some people even say, well, wherever it says Israel, just mark it out and say the church now. So that's probably the worst case scenario. But I realize there's going to be different terms. But I think if you're going to be consistent with Paul, shalom on all the people that are following this guiding principle, and like a good Jewish teacher, mercy on the Israel of God.
Wow.
It makes sense in the context.
Wow.
And he's bringing it all together, and he's not compromising this message of grace, but he's seeing the higher strategy of redemption, which involves Israel. But this epistle is about this Christian group. It's not about the Torah. It's not about the Jewish. It's not about Judaism. It's about this Christian group in Acts 15:1 that he's having some very harsh remarks about. He's not talking about Israel. He's talking about that Christian group. They're Jewish believers.
Yes.
So.
Well, do you have time for one more?
Yes.
Okay. Well, when we come back, I'll ask Dr. Young my other question. But until then, this is Bob Odell with Root Source saying, Shalom. Well, hi, this is Bob Odell with Root Source, and we're with Dr. Brad Young, translator of the Newer Testament, and I'm getting to ask some questions about some passages. So, will you please turn to page 321? We're going to Ephesians chapter 2.
Yes.
And I just like to read, I just love the way this reads. I just want to hear your commentary on chapter 2, verses, let's say 14 to 18. After all, and I get to read this. No, you read it. You read that whole paragraph, 14 through 18. Let's hear it.
Okay. After all, he himself is our shalom, who made both peoples into one. He broke down the barrier of the dividing wall between us, having abolished the hostility, even our sins revealed by ordinances and commandments of the Torah in his physical body, so that in himself he might make the two into one new creation, establishing shalom. As a result, he would reconcile them into forming one body to God through the cross by himself, having put to death the hostility. Moreover, he came and proclaimed shalom to you who were far away, as well as shalom to those who were near. Through him, we both have gained acceptance before the Father in one Spirit.
My question is, would you just speak to those passages? Maybe anything you want to say, what they mean to you, your process of getting to the heart of them in the translation?
Yeah, this is one of those passages where I think we have to see the context of the Apostle Paul. And I think sometimes there is this argument that's going on in early Christianity, some that are saying you need to be circumcised and keep the whole Torah. But here you really see that he's saying there's a hostility that is revealed through our sinfulness. I mean, I think sometimes people, when they're reading the New Testament, they'll see Paul use Torah. Romans 7 is a very good example when we read 7. Well, the Torah shows your sinfulness. But even so, in Romans 7, he says the Torah is holy, the commandment is spiritual, it's just, it's good. But on the other hand, when we look at the Torah, there is hostility in the sense that it shows human weakness, frailty. And so here you see this division. Our sin, the Torah reveals our sin, is bringing this division between non-Jews and Jews. But through the Messiah, the Torah is being revealed in a way that Jews and Gentiles come together. I would say coming to faith in Jesus and ethical monotheism, to live in the Spirit, to receive peace from God. Mm-hmm. But the way that this is sometimes translated, if you notice when I said the hostility, to make it clear, this is what I call a functional equivalency. We have in square brackets, even our sins. Now the Greek text doesn't say that, but I think if we look at Romans 7, we look at Colossians, we look at other parts of Ephesians, that really helps you understand it a little better.
Yes.
It's what we call a functional equivalency. So the hostility is even our sins, revealed by the ordinances and commandments in the Torah. It's not that the Torah itself is evil, but it's revealing this. And as a result, it's death. It's kind of like Romans 8. The Torah is the spirit of life. It's the spirit of death. Some people say there's two Torahs. One is of Jesus. One is the Jewish Torah. Some people have 8 different Torahs. But if you look at the way Pharisees use Torah, and you know this, Bob, from your many experiences with Orthodox Jews, Torah is so much bigger. It's God's plan. It's God's strategy. Torah can be life. Torah can be death. It depends on our response to it. If you respond in faith, it's life. And so that's what Paul, I think, is saying here, that Yeshua in himself made the two one by bearing our sins, taking them to the cross, ending the hostility. And I think this is something really big in Romans 10. I think this relates to Romans 10:4, often translated, "For Christ is the end of the law." Well, how can that be right when we read in Romans 3:31 that Paul says, "Do we cancel the law by the preaching of faith?" He says, "Make anointed." It can't be, never be. God, heaven forbid. Heaven prevent it. No, the word "end" there is telos, should be goal or purpose. He says, "For Christ is the goal of the Torah." What is the goal in Romans 10? It's about the non-Jew and the Jew coming together in faith. And the whole goal of the Torah, and we see this in the 8th century prophets, Isaiah, Micah, they have this vision that non-Jews will go to the temple. Beit Tfilah lo kol ha'amim yikarei. My house shall be called a house of prayer for all peoples. They have a court for the Gentiles. Wow. They want them to come and pray. I liked one scholar, they said, I think there was a little bit of humor. It says, well, they're all going to come and pray. They didn't think they were going to be circumcised when they got there. Now, it's a little humorous in a way, but it's really the argument in the New Testament. Because some says, well, we got to circumcise them before they go in there. And we got to make sure that they're going to keep kosher. And Paul says, forget that. They need to have faith in God. They need to be ethical. They need to live the faith, but they don't have to be pretend Jews to be accepted. And if they want to do more, they can. If they want to do less, but they have to live this up. And so here he's saying, the hostility is gone. We're one creation. We're coming to faith. And, he is very Christocentric. He's very Mashiach-centric. And, I think we would see this in other Jewish messianic movements in history, that here, through Mashiach, this hostility is being taken away, and there's that oneness that comes. I think that's why you and I, as evangelical Bible believers, I don't know that we never like terms people use to describe us, but we have this faith in the Lord and love for the Word, and we have this love for the Jewish people. I think this is something that's happening to many people today. They develop a love for Jews. I've had people tell me, I never liked Jews until I really accepted Christ. And all of a sudden, I love Jewish people. I can't, and people have a default. We have some teachings or prejudice. We have things that are wrong that we've learned from family. Well, when we start reading the Newer Testament, one of the things we're trying to do is challenge these in a way that you read the Newer Testament without these prejudices, and maybe a translation that's Jewish friendly in a sense that it opens up maybe another way of seeing this, so that all of a sudden you have an understanding with the love in your heart. So I think many people have a love in their heart, but they don't have that understanding, and sometimes it's because of the way we've been taught, or translators do the best they can with the Greek text, and we have very good translations. I'll say I feel very humble and inadequate in translating the text. I would say translators know something.
You mean you don't walk on water now?
No, I mean you know something. No, some texts other texts are very hard to translate, and I'm very grateful for much help that I've had from others. But I would say, a better translation, trying to get those things a little clearer, opens up a new word. And I think here is a good point, that a different translation may help you see the main point of the unity and the love. And it's not an attack on Torah. It's saying the Torah reveals our sinfulness, but the Torah also brings us to be one through the work of Messiah.
That's beautiful. I find it interesting that way back in early segments talking about your life, you said, you didn't grow up wanting to translate the Bible. You went to Israel and you saw that there was a need for a better translation, but you didn't necessarily take that up right away. And now it's been a 25-year process to bring out this book. I just want to bless you. And say, I believe this is coming out at the right time. I believe that there is an openness of heart within the people of God, Jew and non-Jew, that a translation that affirms the Hebrew heritage of the New Testament. This is something that I believe can be received. And praise God, I hear from you. There's some success in this. People are getting excited, and you're getting some very good sales. So bless you in that, but I'd like to bless you and the Gospel Research Foundation and the HebrewHeritageBible.com to have outstanding success above and beyond whatever you could have imagined. Not for your sake, but for the sake of the world, because we need this. And I'm so privileged to be able to interview you today because of the work that you're stepped into and what you've done. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Bob. That's very kind. Appreciate it so much. Thank you.
So, HebrewHeritageBible.com.
And that's the main thing, that people can read and enjoy and discover a new depth of their faith. Read the New Testament. Read the Bible. Study the Bible.
Love it. Let's put them both together up there. Okay. There you have it. Thank you so much for this time. And until next time, Bob Odell, Dr. Brad Young.
Thank you.
Shalom.